Thank you.
Thank you, Carissa, for recording it.
Cool.
I want to thank Carissa for the fantastic work she did on the bylaws. I think she did an awesome job. And so what I'm hoping we can do today is kind of discuss them and basically prepare ourselves. We have a quorum. We have everybody from all the voting members here, so we could actually vote to approve them to be on the ballot for the members to approve. And I would love it if we could come to a consensus by the end of this. That's my goal. So I'm hoping everybody got a chance to look at the bylaws before this meeting. Basically, what we did is first of all, we didn't have to use the RRCA guidelines because we have established that we are a nonprofit apart from RRCA. So we can use whatever we wanted. And what Carissa did was she looked at the RRCA bylaws guidelines, and then she also looked at Red Lizards, and she looked at what was the other, there was another club. So a couple different nonprofit running clubs in Oregon. And we kind of used all of them. So Carissa did a draft, and Julie and I looked at the draft, got it back to Carissa, and she did some stuff. And so that's how we came up with the draft bylaws. We didn't really, I would have to say we didn't change a whole lot. We rearranged a lot and we clarified a lot. So it's more rearranged and much more clear as to how things operate. And it really reflects more how we operate, how we need to be operating to be in compliance with Oregon law and with IRS rules and everything for nonprofit. So that's kind of where we're at right now. One of the things that she had put in the first draft, and then Julie and I took it out, and then she put it back in, and I'm not willing to die on this. I have no hard feelings on it at all. She definitely wanted term limits in there. And I honestly don't care one way or the other. So if you all would like to have term limits in there, that's fine. I thought she had a very well thought out argument for having term limits in there.
Can I ask a question on that? Having not read the revision, is it lifetime term limits or just consecutive term limits?
No, it is. It's consecutive. Well, no, you can have up to 3 terms or 8 years, whichever is less. Then you have to be, and then you could rejoin after a year off. So you could volunteer in other ways, just not as the board. So it's not saying that you can never be on the board again. It just means that you have to take a break.
And that's what's in the current draft?
That's what's in the current draft that we're looking.
Thank you.
And it doesn't follow necessarily the RRCA guidelines or Red Lizards or someone else, right? This was a well thought out, hey, give a chance to people coming up and maybe wanting to be involved and so forth too. Is that my understanding?
Yeah. It really follows the flow of our RCA bylaws. We just used the wording from some of the other clubs and kind of organized it a little bit.
Okay.
On a general principle, I'm in support of the term limits. Just, it's any organization, that's the club's most recent difficulties had to do with certain people being there too long. And I've had
and wanting to be there longer.
Yeah. And I have been on other nonprofit boards where people have been on the board too long. So I am fully in support of term limits. And like I said, it's take a year off, think about it, come back, and
The only thing that I think about is, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to step over you there.
Tracy, might I suggest that we start at the beginning and just work our way through, and when we get to the term limits piece, we'll discuss it there.
Okay,
yeah, agreed. That's fair.
Valerie, did you want to do something? Say something.
Well, I was going to talk about term limits, but if you want to start at the beginning, and I apologize in advance for being a very detail-oriented person.
I'm
Love,
with you,
love it.
Valerie. I'm with you, Valerie.
I need to find out which draft I have. This is the draft, yeah. So basically, it starts out with the name. The name of the organization shall be the Oregon Roadrunners Club, referred to as ORRC, and principal office. We took out the address because the address used to be address because the address used to be the Western Avenue, and we didn't want to put it every time. So we used to put that Oregon shall be located in the state of Oregon. So whatever it is, whatever our current our legal address is will be in Oregon. So then we go into purpose, which was not in there before. And we went to activities and community outreach programs. So that the community outreach was already in there. But again, we didn't change a whole lot of that because
actually purpose wasn't in there at all before. So
yeah, I like on the purpose. On the first sentence is to provide a community-based running and multi-sport organization. I think running and multi-sport can be taken out. I think running and multi-sport can be taken out. It talks about that empowers all people to participate in running, walking, and related activities. So I think it's
Redundant.
So a community-based organization that empowers all people. So just take out the words running and multi-sport.
yes.
Good.
And then on the community outreach program, it's another just little thing on at the end of the first sentence that it says organizations and youth groups that align with our mission. I think it should be its mission. I don't know. How do you refer to org? Is our or its?
I think we could just say the club's mission.
Yeah.
Club's mission. Okay.
That's it for that part.
Okay. The next section is nonprofit status and affiliation. And this is where we basically specify we are registered as or ORRC is a registered membership-based nonprofit in Oregon. And how we're incorporated with the state of Oregon in 1977. We also say what our federal IRS tax is. Federal IRS tax exempt 501c3 and our RCA affiliation. So we include all three of those. So it's very clear that we are registered as a nonprofit in Oregon. We are federally IRS nonprofit, tax exempt, and we are RCA affiliated, just to make it very clear all that.
I have one small question on that. Is it in fact a public charity? Is that what 501c3 refers to?
yes.
Is it a charity?
Yes.
It falls within the definition of 501c3.
That is the okay, good, thank you.
State of Oregon would also see us as a charity under how we are registered.
And then the next section, number 4, is membership. And here we basically state membership shall be open to all who are interested in the purposes stated in section 2 above. And it says individuals wanting to participate shall submit dues and agree to follow ORRC's code of conduct, sign a waiver of liability, blah, blah, blah.
Couple of things when we hit down to 4.3.
Yeah. In 4.11, they will be considered to be in good standing only if they are in current status in paying dues. And that's where, in run sign up, you're considered current if you're active, you don't have expired dues. So we needed to make sure we include that.
On the, this is not, I'm glad it says sign a waiver of liability, but do we make people do that?
Yeah.
For all of our events, yes, we do.
And the members, says the members will do that. So if they don't participate, it's really picky here, I know, but
It's on run sign up.
Yeah,
When you
yeah, I mean, I like that it's in there. It's a good thing.
it just says reliability for, yeah. So they sign the waiver at the time that they sign up for the activity.
That's right. That's right. when they register.
So also for good standing, only members in good standing are entitled to vote in any membership meeting or serve in any ORRC elective or appointed position. So like RDs aren't elected, but they're appointed. They have to be members to be that. So 4.2 Code of Conduct, good sportsmanship and other policies. They promise to abide by the ORRC Code of Conduct. And then 4.3 member benefits include becoming a member of the RRCA and the rights to participate in club business as a voting member, serve as an ORRC board member, and propose amendments to the bylaws. In addition, when available, members receive such benefits as are established by the ORRC board.
Okay.
So I had some questions about those benefits.
Okay.
One of them was to the club documents or club, let's see, club records such as, does that include like a list of members?
No, records would be like, they can see the bylaws, they could see our tax returns, they could see that, but we would not give out private information would not
Board
be.
minutes?
It should include all of that per Oregon state law, actually, including membership list, board meeting minutes, actions taken by the club. It does include the membership list.
Well, it's the membership list, but not members' information, you know. So we're not giving out private information, just names.
Could be the email. We have the right to, as members, to get the membership names and emails to contact them. That's Oregon state law.
Yeah. So with that, there's probably some guardrails we want to put around how those can be utilized after dispensing those.
Yes.
You can't sell them, can't give them to an outside organization. I think there's some things that we might want to, you know, put the guardrails on. Is that under code of conduct?
Or we could cite Oregon, we could refer to the Oregon law that does say it has to be for a proper purpose.
Okay.
But yeah, it doesn't specify that now, perhaps it should.
And there's a question that I have in regards to that, and that is, should we have members sign a waiver about how their information is to be used? I know many other organizations that I'm with, for example, if I go to a conference, they have a little checkbox that says, we can give your information to a vendor and I can check it off or reject it.
So I think for ORC
is there
that
something we should do there?
It's automatically that you can't, we don't sell. I think that's one of the things is that we don't sell our membership list. But then also when you sign up, you can be anonymous.
And we do have that. We do have the anonymous option in Run Sign Up.
Mm-hmm,
In fact, that screws people up a lot. It screws people up a lot because they don't realize what they're doing when they check on it.
Yeah. I think in terms of like a woman who has domestic violence issues and she doesn't want her name out there. So
yeah, you do have the option when you become you can put anonymous. So when you register for events, your name, when you log into Run Sign Up and register for an event, you are entered as anonymous. You're not entered with your name.
Does that answer your question, Alan?
Not completely, because I remember when we had the brouhaha over the past leadership, many of us asked for the membership list and the email listing. And I know some people are adamant that says this is public information. It should be available to us. I think at some point we should probably make it clear in the bylaws what we legally can do, what we legally cannot do. It protects both the membership and it protects us. And I don't know what the wording would be, but I do believe we should get it in the bylaws directly.
Even if you know, there's a right to request it and share that information, do we still have the option to require people that get that membership list to maybe sign a waiver saying they won't sell it or do anything ORC wouldn't do?
That's a great idea.
Yeah,
You do have to, the Oregon state law says if they want to request the records, they can. They have to say the purpose.
Okay.
You know, they can't just say, I want those records.
Well, yeah, but I don't want some, I'm gonna pick on insurance people, but I don't want some insurance guy asking for it because he's a member and contacting all of us, you know?
Right, well, he has to say why he wants it, and if it's not
Yeah.
a legitimate reason, we can refuse him. If they
Okay.
don't list the reason, we can also refuse them. They have to say, it's because I want to talk about who's running for the board with my fellow members. That's a legitimate reason. Even in the past, we could have said because we want to talk about whether Steve Wright is running the board correctly. That would have been a legitimate reason. They might not have liked that, but that would have been a legitimate reason.
Yeah.
Could we do something a little bit in terms of the wording in the bylaws, just to say we may receive copies of club records according to Oregon law, and that way we
yes,
have to go into all the specifics. We can just
That's great. And then if the law changes,
Yeah.
we're keeping up to date with it. So that's
exactly.
it would be
Yeah.
something like pursuant to Oregon law, records are available based on legitimate purpose, and then we would have to determine who says whether or not it's a legitimate purpose. And my sense is the executive committee of the board would state whether or not they believe it's a legitimate purpose.
And I don't think we even have to get into that much detail. I think if we just say pursuant to Oregon law, and then somebody does request, and we can say, okay, this is what the process is, but we don't have to have everything spelled out in the bylaws, just pursuant to Oregon law.
Right.
Okay.
Can I go back to 4.5? This is
Oh, we haven't reached 4.5 yet.
oh sorry. When we get there. I have a
Always
question.
thinking ahead, aren't you?
Okay. So member classes and voting rights, that really hasn't changed. We're just kind of clarifying the types of membership there. And then terms of membership, this is 4.5, Valerie. The terms of membership shall be established by the ORRC board. Different classes of membership may have different terms. Initially, all memberships are for 1, 2, or 3 years as selected by the applicant at the time of application, except for student memberships, which are for 1 year. Memberships are non-transferable. Membership in ORRC will be on an annual basis for a 12-month period that starts the day dues are processed by ORRC.
So that's what's confusing to me. The second sentence says they'll be for 1, 2, or 3 years, and then the last sentence says they'll be on an annual basis for a 12-month period. So I just found that really confusing.
We can take out that last sentence and just say that memberships in ORRC start
The day dues are processed.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Are we talking here about the 1, 2, or 3 being board members?
No,
Because my sense is
No, it's
someone.
when you pay for your dues, you can do it for a 1, 2, or 3 year period.
It's just to reflect what we
Okay.
actually do and run sign up.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Okay.
yeah, the board membership is in a different section.
And that I do know.
So 4.6, termination of membership. A membership shall terminate on the occurrence of any of the following events: resignation, expiration of the period of membership, failure to pay dues within the time period set, death of the member, and revocation of membership under section 4.6.2 of these bylaws, which is the next section.
Mhm.
Revocation membership may be revoked for cause, including but not limited to failure to adhere to the code of conduct and other policies stated in section 4.2. Revocation can only be conducted by a 2/3 majority of the ORRC board following at least 15 days notice to the affected member. The affected member may, within 10 days of the sending of a notice, request a public or private hearing before the ORRC board at the board's next meeting. Individuals whose membership has been revoked are not eligible for re-entry as ORRC members for a minimum of 12 months, and within 5 years of revocation may only be readmitted by a majority vote of the ORRC board. Revoked members' dues shall be refunded in proportion to the amount of time remaining on their membership.
Question.
Uh-huh.
Can a revoked member continue to attend or events, races and so forth?
A lot of non-members attending our events. So this doesn't bar them from doing our events. It just prevents them from being a voting member or being eligible to volunteer in many capacities.
We had that happen once in my time, and we did bar that particular member from participating in events for a period of time.
If they
Would that be a
violate the code of
separate-
conduct, right?
Would that be a separate matter? Would that be under
Yeah, so it'd be a separate
a
matter.
race
A
director's?
separate and unique matter.
Mhm.
Okay,
I need to get rolling. So, I'm in, whatever y'all changes you make, I'm in support of. Everybody, I'm in good.
take care, Mark.
Yeah,
The
we can vote on it,
VP
so
of
we gotta
races shall take on all responsibilities for.
For all
That's a
races.
Special provision, the one in Mark, yeah, thank you. All right.
All right,
Thanks, Mark.
Yeah.
Was this provision, was a similar provision like this in effect previously? And did we use it with Les Smith?
it was not in there before, I don't believe. No, and Les
Okay.
was, yeah, this was, and that's because he didn't adhere to the code of conduct because he broke the law. So that we
Mhm.
were in the right to revoke his membership.
I guess my broad question, did we revoke his membership correctly under the provisions of the board bylaws at that time?
There was a section on revoking membership in there, but I don't remember.
That was
what
for
it
directors, not
That was for directors, not for members.
There wasn't anything for
Yeah.
members.
I thought there was something that it was around criminal,
Yeah, I think that might have been in the board section though, but not under general members.
Criminal misconduct in running activities. something like
Yeah.
that. That was
okay.
invoked once previously too.
Not all of them.
Mhm.
Okay, moving on to
Okay.
section 5 is dues. Annual dues. Annual dues rate for ORRC members shall be set on an annual basis by the board and shared annually with the membership as part of the regular join and renew process of the club. Pretty straightforward. 6, meeting of the membership. First, it goes into the definitions. Meeting of the membership is a business meeting of which members of ORRC are entitled to vote on matters properly coming before them. Meetings of the ORRC board are addressed separately in section 7. So there's 2 separate meeting sections. Annual meeting of the members shall be held during the month of January or other such month as may be selected by the ORRC board. So if we want to change it, we can.
So I've got a question here up front. One of the things I look for and I don't see, what is the purpose of the annual meeting? Should state a purpose, and I could not find a purpose in here.
To vote?
Well, it's
Why
not
are we
really,
having an annual meeting?
I think it's not in here. My interpretation of the annual meeting is to invite people once a year to come and see how we're doing. If they're not voting on anything, we're just giving them like a state of the union. This is what's going on.
In the club,
State-
yeah.
This is what's going on in the club. State of the club. So we might tell them, here's the budget, here's
I
how,
think it's,
yeah.
However, it
think
is
it's
a
value-
requirement for nonprofit status, I believe.
yeah.
And maybe Carissa, you could mention something around that. I think it is a requirement.
Oh, no, I don't want to eliminate it. But what I would suggest is if it is to give the membership a state of the club, I do think it's important for us to put in there what the purpose of the meeting is.
Okay.
The board, that is required to give an annual report to the membership,
Is that
the annual meeting.
stated somewhere else in here?
I don't
If that's what
know.
we, if that's what we want to state, you see, I'm not arguing that I'm not suggesting what we state. What I'm suggesting is that it's important for us to state why we're doing it.
And maybe that's where we could put an annual report shall be presented.
Sure, that'd be great.
I mean, yeah,
And other matters for the membership to consider, perhaps.
we have a sentence in there, the annual meeting must be held at least once per calendar year to I'll just put update members on the status. That's what we're doing, basically.
Yeah.
Okay. And if that's it, again, I think it's important that we put it in there.
Yeah.
I have a suggestion about cleaning up the language of this paragraph because there's a bunch of redundancy in here. So I wrote something, and if I can read it and let people listen to it and see what it sounds like.
Okay.
So from the beginning, if I can, is that okay?
Yeah,
Is
go
it
ahead.
for 6.2 or which one is it?
6.2.
Okay, great.
An annual meeting of members must be held once per year at a time and place designated by the ORRC board, and finish that sentence as is. The annual meeting may be combined with a meeting of the ORRC board. Then I've eliminated that next sentence because we already have it. All of the members' meetings are special meetings. And I've eliminated the phrase, if the meeting of the membership must be postponed, because we don't say where it was in the first place, but simply the board may schedule the date of the annual or other meetings, etc. And that cleans up the language a little bit. And if it sounds good, and I can reread that, and if it sounds good, I can send that to you later on.
Yes.
There's some wording in there. I like that that it says it could be held in various ways. And I really like the idea of the 14-day notice, because I'd hate to have a little run by where we have someone saying the night before, we're going to have a meeting tomorrow, and then nobody gets notified or has the ability to show up.
And I have kept both, I have retained both of those.
Oh, you have?
In my
Okay.
rewrite. Absolutely. I agree with you 100% on both.
Why don't you go ahead and send your rewordings to Carissa and myself, and we'll incorporate that.
Okay,
Like
good
that.
deal. Thank you.
Thanks.
6.3 special meetings. Other meetings of the membership may be conducted as deemed necessary by a majority of the board. The board shall call a membership meeting upon the written request, including email, or 10% of the total number of voting membership. The board will determine if the meeting will be held in person or via tele or video conferencing. The board will determine the method of voting for a special meeting. So basically saying that we can have, and then written notice, which includes at least 2 email notifications stating the day and time of the meeting. Basically says won't be delivered less than 10 days or more than 50 days prior to the date of the meeting. So that's just how you call it special. We don't really do. 6.4, the annual election may be held separately from the annual meeting, which it is definitely, if the ORRC board so decides, which we're going to do. And then 6.5 is the moderator.
Hang on, before we move on, that first sentence in 6.4, I would suggest eliminating that, because at no other point did we say the annual election and the annual meeting together. I think if we eliminate that sentence, it still doesn't affect anything we do. I think that sentence is superfluous and may get in the way.
Okay, so we're just going to say
Ideally, the annual election, etc.
which
So
part am I eliminating?
So in
Separately.
6.4,
Yep.
eliminate the first sentence and retain the second sentence that begins with ideally the annual election.
Down here.
That's the reason I put that in there is normally or traditionally annual elections are part of the annual meeting. And now that many organizations are voting online, it's not true anymore. So it's just kind of clarifying that.
I think it
Yeah.
helps set up not to expect the 2 meetings to happen at the same time, that they could, but they may not.
It's unlikely if you're voting towards the end of the year and have a annual meeting in January, though.
Yeah.
So do we want to take it out or leave it in?
I like it the way it is.
So keep it in?
That's just my
Okay,
taste.
I've no, yep, and I have no problem with that.
Okay. All right. 6.5 is moderated. The ORRC president shall preside over the members' meeting in the president's absence. The task shall go to the VP of Race Operations, Secretary, Treasurer, the president's designee, or anyone elected from among the members present at the meeting in that order of precedence. So
this is really nitpicky, but 6.2 and 6.4, the bolded words, that's the only two little phrases where every word is not capitalized.
oh, right. Oh, got it.
I
6.2.
mean, it's really nitpicky, but
So capitalize the bold part.
yeah, like the annual election, each of those three.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Got it. Okay, all right. Okay, then we get to Board of Directors and annual election. This is section 7. Officers and directors, the members vote to elect the ORRC Board of Directors, who is thus entrusted with managing the affairs of ORRC. Definitions of director is any member of the ORRC board. Some directors are officers. All directors have equal voting rights. Officers include president, vice president of race operations, secretary, and treasurer, with more detail as defined in section 8. Number and eligibility, this hasn't changed. The board has a total of a minimum of 6 and a maximum of 20, which are elected by directors, including officers, which are elected by the board. So this is where we really clarify: the members elect the directors elect the officers. All board members must be current dues paying members. At least one officer must be a U.S. citizen and resident of the state of Oregon. So if somebody can be a board member without being a resident of Oregon, like Margie.
Hey,
Why do
am I
we
the example?
why does it say
You
just
are,
at least one officer, not the majority of officers, or we don't care?
I think that's just
If we all want to
IRS.
move to Vancouver, at least one of us has to stay in Portland.
Yeah, okay. And
Well,
then,
remember too that, for example, when I was president and when I was on the board and Alan was, Dell and Charles Scharfenberg were board members for years, and they were Vancouver.
yeah.
They were president of Clark
Mhm.
County. So
I think we have to have at least one person in Oregon because we're Oregon nonprofit, but everybody else.
yeah,
Okay, that makes sense. And then on the
one member
Yep,
in Oregon or one officer.
At least one officer.
one officer.
and
Okay.
resident.
And then on section 7.2, it says officers include blah, blah, blah. And then it says with more details defined in section 8. I'm wondering if there's a better way to, like, and other officer roles is defined in section, I don't know. I don't
like
have a
that.
better answer, but that was my guess.
As defined.
And all it says in section 8,
But as follows in section,
it just says that we can make other.
more detail, with more details provided in section.
And all
actually
it says in
do,
section 8, and it's section 8.1, not section 8. I'd be specific.
But
yeah,
so
I'm actually with you, Val,
Yeah.
the phrase with more details defined in section 8, I think is superfluous,
Yeah.
because we're gonna get there later.
so take it out.
Just
Just take it out.
simply the officers include
Well,
these
I'd say
people.
no, because what it says, I think this is done correctly. It's just the wording I'm questioning. And it's section 8.1. We should be direct people right to the other section.
Right. So how about
Yeah.
how, with more detail provided in section 8.1?
No, I'm saying it should be in other officer roles as defined in section 8.1. The
Yeah.
wording needs to be changed a little.
What wording do we want?
Oh,
Just take out with more detail and pop in with other officer roles as defined. Or with and other officer roles, because what it says in 8.1, we'll get there, is we can make up, like, we can have a VP of marketing, we can add other roles if we so choose as a board.
mhm.
Okay, with officer roles defined in section 8.1. Is that how we want to say it?
As defined, yeah.
Roles as defined. Okay.
Hang on.
Or do you have something better?
Do we want the possibility of more officers, or do we want to keep it? The officers are these 4 positions, and we could add other positions, but they would
That's
not
what-
be officers.
No, we want roles for officers because I think we've had a VP of marketing before and other roles like
Right.
that.
But is
Are
Alan,
those directors?
is Alan asking, do we want to be able to add more officers?
I think we
And
do
my-
because there might
that
be,
is it, yeah.
I think we do because we might want a VP of marketing or a
I think that we can have,
communications.
I mean, we're required to have a president, treasurer, and secretary. Those are the three we require, and a vice president. I think we can have people take on responsibility of marketing, but not necessarily give them a title of officer. They're still a board. They can be a board member, but not necessarily an officer, because everybody has equal voting rights anyway.
But
So-
if you go, I'm skipping ahead,
Yeah,
and it's if you go to 8.1, it says, and other such officers as the ORRC board may appoint. I think it's done right. I think it's not that we have to do that, but someone in the future might want to do that.
Right,
Mhm.
this allows for more, and we've had more before. We've
Yeah.
had membership secretary and administrative secretary, and we've had a VP of marketing in the past.
and what I'd suggest is to go along with what Tracy said. The officers, it implies that these are people at slightly higher levels of decision making. Whereas everyone else, we can add on more and have a number of other people, but these four are the core.
But
And
I
so I
think
would prefer to keep these four as the core.
But I disagree, I guess. I don't think we
Okay,
need to have
okay.
anything now, but I just think that it's good to have that option available.
Okay, so could the wording then in section 7.2, because right now we have with officer roles as defined in section 8.1, we could put with
Right.
other officer roles as defined in section 8.1. And that's
Right,
where
all it says in 8.1 is
Yeah.
that the board has the right to do it if they want to.
right. So in 8.1, we can create other officers as we see fit, but we're only
Right.
defining the minimum what we have to have in this section.
Right, that's correct.
So I'll add the word other with other officer roles as defined in section 8.1.
Okay.
Okay, we were down to 7.4. Nominations, the president may appoint a nominating committee of at least 3 ORRC members to solicit and nominate candidates for the board of directors. So this is one that Carissa added in there about nominating committee, and she makes a very good argument for it. I don't necessarily feel that's necessary to be in the bylaws, but I understand her argument in favor of it. And so I understand it, and
This gives me a Steve Wright PTSD.
So, yeah, so as I read this, the language that's in here is the president may appoint a nominating committee, and then if a nominating committee is so appointed. So this does not require the president to do so. And with that proviso, I'm happy with this.
So why is it, I guess, I'm fine with it, but I'm wondering why it's not the board would appoint, why it's just the president. And that's where I'm coming to the Steve thing, because he always had, and I was part of it at one time, his little executive group that made all the decisions before the meetings, and it was a little creepy.
Mhm. Do you want to change that to the board may appoint? The board may appoint a nominating committee?
Yeah, I think it's the board, and it says the word may, like Alan pointed out, so it's not requiring it. And I think it'd be a great idea. It's just, I don't want one it not against you, Tracy, but I think it puts a lot of power in the hands of one person to
She's creating a dictatorship.
help themselves. Yes, exactly.
Okay, so we changed that. Any board, 7.4.2, any board member may nominate more than one person for each open position. So basically it talks about the nominating process, and 7.4.3 self-nominations can be added, and recommended names will be added to the ballot unless the board determines that the recommended nominee is unqualified, which means they don't meet our definition of membership, for example, or something like that. Unsuited for office, provided that no person may be placed in the ballot without that person's consent. So we can't draft somebody. And then 7.5, elections, candidates, ballots, and voting. This just talks about the names of the known candidates will be made known to their membership. Write-in candidates may be submitted, which we do have on our ballot. Elections may be conducted in multiple of ways, which includes online, electronically. And directors shall be elected by a majority vote. This is important, of the members present and voting, or for elections conducted online by a majority vote of the members participating by voting in the online election. So even if we have 700 members, we don't need a majority of 700. If only 300 vote, we only need 150 plus 1 for the majority. That's the explanation of that one.
Tracy, I apologize. I was up getting some tea when I had a quick note to go backwards to 7.4.2.
Okay.
My apologies, but I was out for a second. That sentence, which says any member may nominate more than one person. My sense is it should be any board member may nominate one or more.
Okay.
Oh,
Thank you.
sure.
Switch that, no problem. Okay. See, quorum. The annual election will be a majority of board of directors and the lesser of 50 voting members, or 10% of the current voting membership. So that would either be, so we need at least 50 people. We need at least 50 basically, because we have about over 700 and something members. So that would be 70. So lesser is 50. So as long as we have 50 people voting, we're good. And then 7.6.1 talks about failure to achieve a quorum. And then term of office for directors. This is shall be 1, 2, or 3 years as prescribed by the position. If a director has served 3 consecutive terms or 8 years in a row, whichever is lesser, a 1-year absence. So this is where we got into the term limits. And Valerie, you had a question about the term limits.
Yeah, okay, so my question on this is why the 8 years thing? Because if someone serves as president and they did 3 consecutive terms, that means they have to leave 2 years in, and it's kind of throwing up the whole rotating shift of people going around. So that was my only question about this.
I could make it 9.
You could just say 3 consecutive terms. I was just not sure why that was chosen.
I chose it because I was following the RRCA sample.
Oh, that makes sense. I just thought because it seems like a lot of care was putting into kind of making this so people kind of are reelected in a cycle, and then it would be odd for someone serving as a president in their 3rd term to leave 2/3 of the way in.
It would depend, because most people are elected, like the new people are all coming in with 2-year terms.
But it says later that like the president, treasurer, and maybe secretary are 3-year terms.
Yeah. I guess
So
the question is, would they want the president to serve more than 2 3-year terms? Yeah, I think that's kind of the point, is that if somebody's been president for 6 years, do you want them to then run again for another 3-year term?
9 total. Yeah, that is the big question.
Yeah. The other thing is the 3-year term assumes the first year is like a training. And I'm not doing a 3-year term. I'm doing a 2-year because of that year of training. So the president doesn't have to be a 3-year term, but
but it's an important role. And my other only concern about this.
So before we leave that one, Val, let's move on to something else. It's later on, it's not clear that a 2nd or a 3rd term would be a 2-year or a 3-year, because if it's a 3 years training, would then the next term be 2 years, or would the next term be 3?
I think it's pretty clear that those specific roles are 3 years, and then the other roles are 2 years later on. But
so maybe I'm interpreting it wrong. My understanding is that all terms are 2 years. But the treasurer, hang on, but the treasurer and the president are given an extra year for training their first time. So they have a chance to get their ground legs under them. But it's still a 2-year term. It's never going to be a 3-year term. It's a 2-year term, with their first year being kind of an extra, so they can shadow the previous guy and be ready to take it on.
Or gal.
Maybe when we get to that, maybe we should look at that, and then
I'm against any elected term being more than 2 years at a time.
Yeah, and then my only real concern, I'm generally in favor of this, but my only real concern, and I mean, this is the reason Stephen came on, because nobody else wanted to take the role on. And this is a volunteer board and we could get in that situation. So what happens then?
Well, I think as with any organization, you have to develop volunteers into the leadership positions. And I think we were doing fine. We had lots of volunteers, people on the board. We have people coming in who I'm very optimistic about being able to take on the leadership of the club, but you have to keep inviting people and mentoring them and developing them. And the previous board didn't do that. They pushed.
Yeah, but I mean, Tracy, when you left, Stephen was involved but nobody else was willing to step into that role because it's a responsibility.
Yeah, and I think that's what we have to make sure that we do as a board. One of our responsibilities is making sure that we do develop people who are willing to step up. And if we can't find somebody, then we can address that at the time. But I think that that's the toughest thing for any organization, which especially all volunteer.
Yeah.
How do you develop your members into your leadership positions?
And I mean, in general, I think it's great because if you step off for a year and you might come in a different role, but you've been away for a year and decisions have been made to make you have a new perspective too when you come back.
Right. Yeah.
I just think in terms of how like Dave Green was a constant for us. And
we had a number of people like that.
Yeah. So those are the examples that I think, oh, you know, how are we excluding them for a year?
You're not.
Okay.
They're still trusted advisors.
And they're still a director.
They are still
They
there.
can still be a director.
To be involved as needed, to train as needed. After my third year as president, nobody wanted to be a fourth year.
Yeah.
Ralph raised his hand because nobody else did, and then, as it turned out, Ralph got elected to state legislature, and I ended up doing it a fourth year anyway. And then Jeff Hollister, thank God, stepped up, but I did not have a successor and should have been training one, as Ralph did with me, and Jeff did with Margie and so forth. So, I mean, we were lucky. We got tagged and we got prepared for it. And this is just kind of making sure that does happen. And not only that, it's kind of ensure you have a good lead. But people like Dave Green, he can be a helper. He can work with the treasurer and, you know, be there for a year and then come back on the board again.
And they can still attend board meetings as guests. It doesn't mean they can't attend.
So if the worst were to happen and there was nobody else to take the role, would it just be a case of, at that point, the bylaws could be amended to deal with that situation?
If needed.
I hate doing that.
I do too.
Doing that.
I'm just saying this could happen in the future. We have to think of the options. Other than that, I love this idea.
That really is the purpose of a nominating committee.
Alan, what did you want to say, Alan?
So first of all, directors can continue forever. We've got that there. But
No. The term limits applies to directors.
Okay, I thought I saw something.
Yeah.
What I do say is there's no limitation on the total number of terms a director may serve.
That's a lifetime. 3 lifetimes.
You just have to take that 1 year.
Oh, okay.
You have a year break.
Okay. So the main thing that I wanted to say is generally, I'm actually not in favor of term limits because of the Dave Greens, the Ralph Browns, the Bemroses, and so forth. And generally, I don't like putting something into a bylaws because there has been an abuse. Having said that, if we are having term limits for all the reasons that everyone has stated, I would think that 6 years would be a maximum. 6 is a long time. 8 years, I think, is much, much too much. So if we want term limits, I would suggest 6 is the absolute maximum.
I actually like 8, and the
No,
reason
I like 8, yeah.
reason I like it is because somebody might join the board and not be an officer for a year or two, and then want to step up and be an officer and like a treasurer, and then step up to be president. And so that could be like an 8-year flow of everything versus 6. You might not have that opportunity. So that's kind of why I like the 8.
Then what I would say, I agree with you. Then what I would suggest is no more than 6 consecutive years as an officer or in one officer position. Yeah, I hear what you're saying, and I like that.
So,
But I would not want to see a president for more than 6 years, for example. To me, that's
well, I could see them
that's control.
if they came in 3 and then they did a 2-year and a 2-year.
What if they swap from treasurer to president?
Oh, and that's my other question. This doesn't seem to address.
And that I have no problem with, yeah.
What, Valerie?
So the three and the
Go ahead, Valerie.
Oh, okay, it says the board, so it is addressing. I'm sorry.
So the 3 and the 2 and the 2, I would consider that first year of the president almost as a vice president, while the outgoing is still being president, and then 6 years after that as president.
Let me take a poll just real quick. What people yay or nay on term limits with just your gut reaction? Do you want it in there? We can talk about number of years, but we can ask, do you want it in there or not? And then we can discuss if we do want it in there, more detail.
Yes, I want it in with 3
Yes, I want
3 elected 2-year terms.
No, we'll get there later, Daniel. We'll get there later, Daniel.
You wanted a
Just
yes or
yes or
no on
no.
term limits? The answer is yes.
Yes.
My answer is no.
I'm a yes.
Do I get a
No
vote?
pressure.
Not yet.
Not yet.
Unfortunately.
Not yet. I didn't think so.
But what do you think? What's your opinion?
I say yes, I think.
I'm really torn because
Yeah.
I agree with Alan about I don't want to push people away who have been hopeful, and I hesitate to establish a policy in the bylaws based on 1 or 2 instances of abuse that might tie our hands down the road if we have issues. So I'm
Term limits are common though, for a reason.
And I think it will help us kind of go out to members saying, hey, we can't run. We got to bring you guys in. Somebody has to step up.
Yeah,
And
I'm gonna give you my, I'm term limited on city council, and I think it's really pushed me to help bring up other people that I've, that can come into that role, and it makes you think about it more. That's generally why I'm for this.
It forces some
Well,
succession planning.
Yeah.
What's his name? And I can't even think of his name now. There were term limits, and he didn't do any of those. What he did was try to change the term limits. So if people are going to abuse the system, they're going to abuse the system.
It's true.
But this would have helped. This would have helped us 5 years ago, not get us here. Plus, I keep coming back to this thing. We are volunteers, and burnout is a real thing. So we've got to be really careful when people start committing to, and if it means they take a break and say, "Gee, I like taking a break." Guess what? Sometimes if that's the case, we need a break, and they're probably not the board member. They're probably effective for a while, and now they need a break. You didn't have to convince me to leave the board when it was my turn. Please believe me.
I would add one sentence, something along the lines of, and I have not written this, so it's hard to say how it'll come out. It is the responsibility of an officer in his or her last year of the term to begin succession planning.
I think it needs to happen before a year. I think it, as soon as you take your position, you are providing a you're developing your succession plan. And
Yeah.
I think it
is
might be
very-
more appropriate to put it in to the I know the training material or whatever we're going to provide for new officers coming in of, okay, so you've got this position. Now is the time to start looking for your replacement.
I agree. Yeah,
And it doesn't have to be part of the bylaws.
no.
Yeah,
All right, so we're consensus that I keep it in. We're
Okay.
gonna keep, I would say let's
Yep.
keep it in. So, and this is the 8 years, is that an okay term? Is that a okay number?
so I'll go back to something I suggested earlier, and that is for the president and the treasurer, which is the training period. The first year, the person serves as co-president or co-treasurer, and then has 3 2-year terms maximum after that.
Exactly. That's my understanding.
Mhm.
We don't have it. We did have that in there under the president though. That's down under the roles. The roles, yeah. I would need term. Yeah, under 8.4 term of office, the president and treasurer hold 3-year terms, with the first year of each 3-year term being a training year, and all other officers hold 2-year terms. So we kind of have that in there, that the first year is training.
But if,
So then,
I think it needs to be worded
then-
somehow, if a president or
Yeah.
treasurer holds consecutive terms, that the next 2 are 2 years. I don't know how to word that.
Okay,
Does that make
why don't we
sense?
just say their role, why don't we just say the president has a 2-year term, but may have a 1-year training period before they become president?
In their first term.
Apprenticeship.
Not in their first term. Their first term is just the 2-year term, 2-year, this
Yeah.
is. Before they start that 2-year term, they may have a training year before that.
Okay, that's a good way to phrase it. Yeah.
Because that way, the two, everybody has 2-year terms, and we're not trying to, okay,
Yeah.
so president
And
treasurer
do we want to call that co-president?
No, you don't want co-presidents.
Okay.
But what we could have is with the, so I have president and treasurer hold 2-year terms, and then change it from with the first year of each 3-year term. They may have a president-elect or treasurer-elect
Year of
training year of 1 year.
before taking
Training,
office.
yeah, training of 1 year before taking office.
And I like the president-elect, because
Yeah.
that assumes that in the first year, the person is elected president, and at the end of that president-elect year, that individual automatically becomes president.
And
Good.
same,
Okay,
But then if we had like Tracy, for example, if you left and then came back again, you don't really need a training year.
we're gonna need it. Yeah, so it has, yeah,
That's that May. Okay.
okay,
at their discretion.
all right, cool, that sounds good. All right, moving along. That was a quick one to decide.
That was
Thank
a
you.
hard one.
Thank you for that discussion. Duties, the board of directors shall be the governing body of ORRC and has total oversight of the management affairs, funds and property, carries out the mission, blah, blah, blah. 7.8.1, the board.
We have that in there, blah, blah, blah.
We do have that in, blah, blah, blah.
We
7.8,
do.
and there we just had bullet points. The board shall provide fiduciary, legal, and strategic oversight, and guide the organization by adopting sound ethical policies, review all information provided by the treasurer and other board members related to oversight for the organization, participates in all scheduled board meetings, ensures adequate resources and financial sustainability, serves as ambassadors for the organization, hires and sets compensation for any independent contractors, race directors, coaches, or staff, because we do hire some people, holds itself and ORRC accountable to ongoing commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion, recruits candidates for board service. That's all in our job description.
Bravo.
Delegates duties provided for in these bylaws to employees, officers, and committees, provided that the board maintains oversight of such activities. So that's kind of general what the board is going to do.
So I have a little,
Tracy? Oh,
Valerie first.
I have a
we're
little
gonna say the
grammar
same
thing here. It's, yeah, it
Yes,
says the
yes,
board
yes.
shall, the board singular, the first bullet
Yep.
point is singular and all the rest start with the S
Yes.
at the end of the word.
Okay, so it
Yes.
should be
You
provides
beat
instead
me
of
to the punch,
provide.
Valerie.
Okay, so add an S to provide.
No, or either that
No,
or
no, no, no,
or
no.
take
the
off the S.
opposite. It's the opposite. All the other
Eliminate the
bullet points-
S's.
Or
yeah,
eliminate
eliminate
the
the
S or the
S's.
singular. Okay, so
It should
take
be
off
review, not
review,
review.
participate, ensure.
And then it's hires,
Yes.
hire and set compensation.
Hire.
Higher.
Yep, take
Yes.
off all the,
Higher and set.
okay, there we go.
Hey, Val, high five.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, officers of the board and additional duties are described.
Fingers on a chalkboard.
7.9 deals with vacancies. That's with death, resignation, removal of any director.
That didn't really change, did it?
That didn't really change. Here's one, removal for non-attendance. This was added. Any director, officer or director who is absent from regular board meetings for an extended period of time shall be deemed to have vacated the position following a vote to this effect by the board. So if somebody,
Ended.
so-
Is there like a time period?
we
Yeah,
didn't,
that was my two things. The first is I think it should be like have a specific time period, like 4 or 6 months, and maybe have a caveat, like some board discretion if it's somebody, maybe it's somebody like that is having cancer treatments and they're coming
Well,
back and you
well,
want
see,
to give them
that's-
leeway.
that's where Carissa originally had, I think it was 3 unexcused absences.
Yes.
And I made it more vague because I wanted to specifically give us flexibility on what do we believe is an unacceptable extended period of absence.
Yeah,
And
my
that's
only
where I am, Tracy, also. I agree with that, Tracy.
you okay.
Because I don't, honestly, as secretary, for example, I have to take the minutes, like who's attending and who's not. I don't necessarily want to have to get into contacting people saying, why weren't you at the meeting? Is this an excused absence or not? I don't want to be the hall monitor about where were you? Okay,
How do we
Yep,
determine?
yep.
I'm afraid someone would come back at us and argue what an extended period of time is.
I think if they come, I think that any type, before we would before as a
It would be
board,
quite long, I would think.
yeah. Before we would vote to say you vacated your position, because we'd have to vote on them being removed, we would need to have a conversation with that person to say, why aren't you
Right.
attending, or what is the reason you aren't, something like that. So I think there's going to be a conversation about what's going to be, and what might be 3 months for one person because they're just blowing us off versus
Right.
6 months because they're going on medical treatment. It's going to be different
Right.
for every person. So
Okay.
that was my logic.
Valerie, would you be happy with the phrase "at the discretion of the board"?
Yes,
Would that help you? Okay.
yes, that would help a lot.
So in the beginning of the sentence would simply say "at the discretion of the board, any officer or director, etc."
I like that.
Discretion.
Good.
Okay, will do. Okay, removal for cause. That didn't really change. Illegal activity, things like that. So that hasn't changed. And then section 8, officers of the
Wait, 7.11, sorry. My issue with this, my concern is that it says that you will have a membership meeting for that purpose, and I'm gonna pull up Patrick Langley. I mean, he was stealing from the club, and I'm concerned if we have to have a membership meeting and give notice and all that, that's kind of a lengthy time to have a person that's a thief.
Oh, yeah, yeah. Okay,
Good.
so do you want to change, what about at a special meeting called for that purpose? Not necessarily a membership meeting, or do you want to put board meeting?
Board meeting.
I think it's a board decision in that case, just because
Yeah.
that was,
It
bad.
doesn't even have to be a special board meeting, it should say board meeting. Okay.
Yeah,
At a
I mean,
board
maybe-
meeting. called for that purpose.
yeah.
But under Steve, he didn't
do that, and he should have.
exactly.
But this doesn't have to be called by the president. This is by the board.
Yes. I mean, that should have been dealt with.
But I see Carissa's point. The old board would never have voted Steve off.
Right.
But was he doing something that was?
No,
removed?
I'm saying Patrick Langley, who when we found
Right.
out, the second we found out he was taking money, that it should not have been, it should have been a quick meeting and decision.
So this.
Yeah, we don't need that to be a public, a
Yeah.
board,
Yeah.
that's a board decision that needs to be handled by the board. And
Yeah,
then
some
the level of discretion it's reported to the group is gonna also be at the discretion of the board based on what the
Mhm.
exposure is.
Right.
If it's handled quietly and it remains quiet, then it'll be done quietly. If it's, on the papers like Les Smith was, then we have to be a little more, but it has to all be at the discretion of the board. And
Right.
we cannot
That's what
do
I'm
that
saying.
publicly. We're not here to eviscerate anybody here.
No, and
But
there's ways of phrasing things to say they.
I just say that it needs to be handled at the discretion of the board. And typically, and it doesn't end with a removal, it ends with a resignation.
Hopefully,
Yeah,
Daniel.
usually it does. So
Okay. So
But there's nothing in the club record about Patrick, and there should have been something.
if it's
well,
at a,
he ended up resigning under pressure. So
Well, yeah, I'm just saying there's nothing recorded anywhere because I looked in the minutes. And as a member, I wondered what happened. That's all.
Well,
And what I would
Emails
suggest,
by many
yeah.
board members got ignored is what happened.
but as Daniel said, we don't want this to be a public brouhaha. And I would, for example, suggest that Director Joe Schmo resigned during this meeting, period.
That
And
would be fine.
everyone doesn't have to know all the dirty
definitely
laundry.
be in the minutes that a vote took place. It's not like you can
Yeah.
say you
Right.
vote. It didn't
Yeah,
resign,
right.
it would be in minutes.
Well,
So-
that isn't even
Well,
there.
the-
That's all.
Yeah, if the person resigned, there would not have been a vote.
because
As
Right.
Daniel said,
well, I
the
mean,
person
Chris's
resigns under
point
pressure.
is that there needs to be a record as to why it was even recommended. I mean, if somebody's looking historically back,
Right.
we don't want to repeat the same thing. And I have my suspicions that it happened before that with another member. So, and we never made a record of it because I was advised not to and wish I had not been advised not to. But there's no record of any of that. And looking back, just so we historically don't repeat the same mistakes again, we just got to be sure that we just need to make sure there's adequate records taken.
I think basically because the minutes were pretty. I think if we were to do something like that now, I would say it might be this person resigned as a board member or as a race director, and the board voted to bar them from holding such office in the future. Not necessarily.
Yeah,
Why?
and
But
you
that-
can just, and I think even if they didn't resign, you can just say they didn't follow the ethics.
Yeah, used for rules violations or something like that.
Yeah.
Or, yeah, because
Ethics
you know,
violation.
I mean,
Mhm.
Because we're not
Carissa
a
said she
for-profit,
scoured the minutes and found nothing, and that shouldn't be the case.
but there needs to be
Right.
something.
Very well. I'm good. That comment in place, I'm good as it stands.
Okay, but not for special membership
You're gonna take the
meeting.
membership meeting
No,
part
we're
out.
changing membership. We're going to
board.
change it at a board meeting called for that purpose.
Okay, perfect.
Exactly. Okay.
Okay. Then section 8, officers and board of directors. This is where we get into 8.1 officer roles. Officers shall include president, vice president of race operations, treasurer, secretary, and other such officers as the ORRC board may appoint. So on. 8.2 nomination and elections. All officers shall be selected from the ORRC board and must be members of the ORRC board, so they have to be elected to the board first.
Okay, so that's where I was gonna come in here. So when I was elected, my term had expired, and I was technically elected as president, did not run for the board. I knew I was going to be nominated for president, and that was probably going to be the only one.
that.
Therefore, I would not have been eligible under this provision. So now, also at that time, our bylaws were different. The bylaws then said we had to have that we had 9 at-large board members, So in the event that a board member is elevated to officer, then another board member could be, so if we were electing 3, then we got to pick in 4 that year. Because one of them got elevated. The at-large board members were treated differently than the officers. What we're saying here, I think we're still okay. What we're saying here is there's not a defined exact number of board members. It's between 6 and 20. So some of those might be elected as officers, and some may simply be, if you're not an officer, then you're an at-large member.
Exactly.
And so the total number of board number holders is our basis of a quorum and a majority for voting. Am I correct in assuming all of that?
Yes.
Okay. The history, what I'm saying is history does not matter. So I'm good the way it says, because this way because again, I go back to when Margie and I were president, we were simply kind of picked by the board, and we did not have to be officers, board members. We were, but I mean, I was when I was elected, because I was at the end of a term. But this kind of cleans that up. I just want to be sure that we're not shorting the large members because of people are becoming officers. I think what this does do is, since we have a different number of officers and the officers are more fluid, I think we're covered. But I just want to be sure that, do we need to mention here that members need to be ORRC members? And I may have missed that part.
They are. They do. It states earlier.
It does say.
Okay, very well.
Section on
Okay,
board.
very well. I just need a clarification. I think I'm good as it stands.
Quorum is that the meetings of the ORRC board is comprised as a majority of the directors. That hasn't changed. Term of office.
I've got it.
Yep.
I have a thought there and a suggestion there. I've been on various boards, including ORRC many years ago, where we did not get a quorum, and rather than the group all just going home, what we did was we continued meeting for discussion purposes only without voting. And we found that very useful. Kept minutes, kept talking, and allowed future meetings to make decisions from where we had been. And I think that that's very useful. So what I would suggest is that the meeting can continue for discussion purposes only,
Well,
rather
this
than
says,
saying you've got to go home.
no, it doesn't say that. It says no official meeting shall be held and no business conducts unless a quorum is present. But it doesn't say you can't meet and discuss.
Yeah,
Yeah,
it's like a normal, when you don't have a quorum in the meeting, you still discuss things, you just don't vote on anything.
But the difference is our minutes taken on the discussion.
Yeah, and I would like to take the minutes
Oh.
on the discussion so that people see what we've talked about.
Okay.
And by the way, I've seen minutes from secretaries that simply do nothing more than highlight this particular motion was made. I mean, they don't necessarily talk about all the discussions in the minutes. When I was, for all 4 years of my presidency, I had Diane Bemrose as secretary, so we had meticulous minutes taken every week. And so had Margie, but we didn't. I've also seen some of the Toastmasters boards I have where, I mean, you get a paragraph maybe for a 2-hour meeting. So we might want to solidify that, but I'm not going to, I mean, as Tracy has said, I don't want to die on that hill.
I think that's up to the discretion of both the secretary and the president, and then the board.
So I
And
have
I'd like to leave that discretion out.
Enough said. Thank you.
So I'm sorry to go back, but back on nominations, I just put a note in there. So when I first got on the board, prior to me being on the board, people had to be a race director before they could be on the board. And then it became, we wanted, when Tracy was on, we wanted people to have volunteered. And in my experience, people that have been on the board since then that weren't volunteers with the club before being on the board typically didn't turn out to be the best board members. So I didn't know if that's just a policy decision we can make later, or if something should be put in the nominations, like that preference will be given to people who have served in other volunteer roles.
I totally understand where you're coming from. I
And
think
it might not belong in the bylaws.
I think, yeah, one, it doesn't belong, I don't think it belongs in the bylaws. I think like when we were inviting people to run for office this time, we were going through and saying, okay, who's participated in a lot of our races, or who's volunteered at our races?
Right, who's really somehow
Member of 1200 Club or done something. So they're knowledgeable about the club. They weren't just somebody coming in from off the street. And I think that's kind of how we did it. So you wanted them possibly to become race directors.
Yeah, it's just when Steve came in, he brought in all these people that had never even been at a club event, and they were typically out for their own best interest, not the club. So
yeah,
that's
I think that's more a matter of
a policy
and procedure, not necessarily bylaws.
Okay. Oh, and then in 8.3, where we were at with the quorum, and the last line, it says, no official meeting shall be held and no business conducts unless the quorum. So that word conducts needs to be just read.
Okay, but so Alan's point of no official meeting shall be held and no business conducted.
So he wants to take that out anyway.
No.
Yeah.
No, you could say, but a discussion can be, but there can be a discussion with minutes taken.
And the language that I have written is that second sentence: if a quorum is not present, comma, the meeting may continue for discussion purposes only.
Oh, I like
semicolon.
Oh, I like that. Yeah, that's good. Second, the meeting may continue for discussion purposes only.
Semicolon, the president must schedule, etc. And then that final central meeting would be stricken.
Okay. Okay, so then the president, we're going to leave that one, but delete the last one. No, this one. Okay, got it. Okay. Okay. All right. So we already did terms of office. Already did 8.4. Vacancy, the president shall appoint any ORRC board seat vacated during a term with approval by the ORRC board within 60 days of resignation from the seat. Appointed term will end with the term of the seat, which is the start of the next regularly scheduled board meeting after the annual election. So basically, if somebody leaves in a crucial position, I would say like VP of race operations or something like that, we could appoint somebody to that position instead of waiting for the next election to have somebody come in for that role. So this just gives us that option, but hopefully we won't have to do that. Other officers, the board of directors may elect or appoint such other officers and agents as it shall deem necessary or desirable. No change there. Removal of a director by the board for non-attendance. That's the same policy as the previous one. So basically,
did we already do that in these bylaws at 7.10?
That was
Is this redundant?
Removal of
a director.
Sorry, it should be removal of an officer by the board for non-attendance. So before it was removal of a director by the board, this is removal of an officer by the board.
Actually, in 7.10, we do say any officer or director. In 7.10.
Yes.
7.10.
7.10 just says.
Oh yeah, there we
It's
go.
redundant, but it's repeated in the officer section in case someone's just referring only to the officer section, I guess.
I still don't like redundancies.
I'm ambivalent. I don't care. We can take that one out. If we have it, removal for non-attendance of any officer or director, that's just since it's in there previously, we can take it out here. Okay.
I'm fine with that.
Can I jump in and say something? I am when we're talking about 7.11 removal for cause and we were talking about it being a membership meeting or not. I think it was 7.11.
Yeah.
I think the purpose of that was to make it clear that the members do have a right to remove directors. So
I think we need to add a separate sentence in there then
so that it's not necessarily the board calling for the removal, but the members calling for the removal.
I agree with that.
Well,
Yeah.
Two things though.
there's two different issues. So there's
Isn't
one
that
where-
under membership benefits or membership?
Right.
Part of what a membership can do is to, let's see, special. Didn't we have that under membership?
Well, there's termination of membership. No,
No, she's talking about 4.3.
4.3.
I have a solution.
Director.
I have a solution potentially. 7.11 removal for cause should be broken into 7.11A and 7.11B. 7.11A would describe how the board could remove an officer, and 7.11B should describe how the membership could remove an officer.
Yeah.
So
Yeah,
the
'cause
board
under
could do
benefit-
it without a meeting, and the membership could call a meeting.
Yeah, because under 4.3, it talks about benefits also include the right to elect directors, remove directors, vote on any change to the number of directors,
That
and
sounds
vote
good.
to dissolve. So that would make sense for.
There's two different dynamics there that could be going on.
So are we going to have one then of the similar wording to the board, and just say that it's members instead of boards? How would
Well,
the
you
members?
could almost leave it like it is and then just say the board has the right.
We could say at a board meeting called for that purpose, or at a membership meeting
Oh, that's true. You could do it that way too.
Okay,
called
that
by
makes
the,
sense.
Yeah,
Oh,
either
but-
way you're gonna, because if you do the AB, you're just gonna refer to the paragraph above.
yeah,
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 okay. So we want to read
good,
it.
that's simple.
So here it's going to say, in accordance, a director may be removed for cause such as behavior is inconsistent, blah, 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 at a board meeting called for that purpose, or at a membership meeting called by the members. Notice for such a meeting must state that the
Good,
Yeah,
of the director.
perfect.
Mhm.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Perfect
perfect,
ideas. Okay.
nice, nice.
Then 8.8, board vote required for removal of officer. Any officer elected or appointed by the board may be removed from office by a vote of a majority of the board members serving on the board. Removal as an officer shall not necessarily mean removal as a board member. So it might mean that we might decide that you guys don't want me as president, but you still want me on the board. You want somebody else in as president, so you have the option to do that. Okay. 8.9, duties of officers, and this just goes into kind of job descriptions of each officer. We tried to be kind of vague there.
On the okay, on the president, I thought you should add sets the meeting agenda.
Actually, that's the secretary usually.
Oh, the secretary just never mind. Add that to the
Well,
secretary.
that's what I've been doing, so.
Oh, okay. And then VP of operations, I thought it says to work with the race directors, and I wanted it to be, and I didn't know how to do this, like provide guidance, like I feel like that role, that person, I know we don't like the word oversee, but it's kind of their responsibility to kind of manage
Coordinate?
for lack of a better term, to make sure that everything's getting done. Like they should be checking in on.
How about coordinate?
Coordinate. I love that.
To coordinate with the race directors of ORRC events and be the liaison between the board and ORRC race directors and other duties. Sound good? Okay.
Then on treasurer, I thought, oh, just the there's nothing in there about handling the accounting process, like the AP, AR, and bank recs. I think like responsibility for the accounting system and accounting process. There's a lot of analytical part of it, but not the nuts and bolts.
That should be the first line, actually. It says,
Yeah.
Responsible for the accounting
System and accounting process, I think would do it.
System and accounting process. Okay, that's simple. Easy to understand. Okay, got it. Oh, almost there. Okay, 9, meetings of the board of directors, board meetings. And again, we didn't change a whole lot of this stuff from previously, so. Shall meet at least 4 times per year. We're meeting more often than that. Open to members, have the right to address the board. Quorum, majority of the directors, voting unless otherwise. Actions of the board require a majority vote of the directors present. Action without a meeting. We may take action without a meeting, like we're doing when we have email discussions or something like that, or email votes. Minutes made available to ORRC members in a timely fashion. Procedures, the ORRC board may function by informal consensus building using general parliamentary procedures. They originally had Robert's Rules of Order in there, and I'm like, no way in hell am I memorizing Robert's Rules of Order.
I have the
Thank
skinny
you.
book version.
Thank you.
See,
Go ahead.
I'm different for the rest of you. I loved Robert's Rules
probably
of Order.
I just want to know.
But for us for here, no. But I just love Robert's Rules.
You're the one, you're like that, what do they call the person that says, no, you have to do this?
He's an HR nerd.
Impulsive.
Call it
Yeah.
what it is. He's an HR nerd.
Yeah.
But Val, I did it only when there was a real reason that served my interest.
I took
So,
a class on Robert's Rules of Order.
Parliamentarian, that's the word I was thinking
And
of.
I will tell you
Yeah.
too,
Yep.
Toastmasters lives and dies by Robert's Rules, and they don't
Yeah.
call it Robert's Rules. They call it parliamentary procedure. So even they don't,
Yeah.
even as people, a group like that with a stick up their butt as much as they do, they don't even use the phrase Robert's Rules either.
So I'm gonna another picky one on 9.4 in the last sentence. It talks about an action. If more than one director objects that the action is taken, it must, if possible, be reconsidered at the earliest possible.
Oh,
What's the if possible in there about?
I like that. Kill it.
Take out if possible.
If possible.
That's good,
the
Val.
earliest- Yeah.
Must be
Yeah.
the earliest possible meeting. Okay, that's fine. All right, committees and task forces, no change here. The board of directors has the authority to create committees and task forces. Finances, 11 fiscal year, didn't change any of this. Checking account should be maintained. Oh, Valerie?
Oh, okay. It says, okay, so on the 11.1, it says the fiscal year shall coincide, and then it says as such, Form 990 and CT 12, and then it says it is due by May 15th, and I thought it should say, I thought it should be more like generic, just saying all required federal and state forms will be filed by the due dates, including extensions. or
Yeah,
something.
that's probably good. Will be filed when due.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
And then on the checking account, I had a couple things. First of all, it says one signature shall be required. I think we should leave that out because in the future we might want to say if it's over X amount, we want 2 signatures. So I'd hate to just
Good
do
idea.
one. And then
And I would want to put that in there now, Val, because I would want the treasurer to be able to do petty cash, or the president to be able to do petty cash. But at a certain level, it protects us to require 2 signatures. And I would want that in
that's
there
a policy
now.
decision though. And so I'd like to just leave that out and make that a policy decision.
Yeah, I don't think that needs to necessarily be in the bylaws, but I do think we need to make that a policy if we want to. If I agree. I
And
think
yeah, so I may be the Lone Ranger again, but looking at the past president, this is one that I would like to get in the bylaws, because the president might have been able to control that policy decision.
Yeah, my only problem is
once he passed.
if we pick a number right now, like say, I don't know, $5,000 or something, in 10 years, that might be only worth, $2,000.
Change the bylaws.
I still think it's a policy thing. I think
Yeah.
it's a
I'm good.
So
Yeah, okay.
perhaps putting
I
it in
mean-
there, something about signatures shall be required per policy on
Okay.
amount of
Be
check to be
decided by the
written or
board.
whatever. Mhm, mhm.
And,
We could
I hate to name numbers because right now, $5,000 might be a park permit, but in 5 years from now,
That's what I'm
$5,000
saying.
might just be a flagger.
That's what I'm
Well,
saying, and these bylaws might be around for 30 years. And,
I mean, so I don't want to start putting tag numbers on there.
right.
Mhm.
We can't have a policy document that lives and breathes next to this.
yeah.
Right.
Which is organizations.
Yeah,
And I think that has to happen later, but it doesn't have to be today.
Yeah, and then it says a checking account, and I think maybe this needs to be reworded, and then it says all monies are deposited credit of ORC in banks that are members or whose deposits are insured by FDIC or other governmental insurance agencies. So right now we're violating this because we have money in a brokerage account, and that's under the securities investor protection thing, but that only covers some of it. It doesn't cover the investment earnings. So I think it could say that are in FDI insured banks or brokerage accounts holding publicly traded securities. So nobody has the option to go, buy some derivatives or something, but
Can't invest in GoFundMe.
yeah, or GoFundMe or
Valerie,
Other
Bitcoins.
government insurance agency doesn't cover that.
no, if you're in a brokerage account, it's not under FDIC, and they have this coverage. It's SIPC, and it covers a lot, but it doesn't cover your investment earnings. It's not as good as FD. It's fine, but
then Valerie, can you
Is it a government agency though?
it is a government agency.
So we're covered.
Yeah, but
It's
the
other
wording just said
government
FDIC or other government insurance. Oh, I see what you're saying. But it says banks. It refers just to banks, and we have money at brokerage accounts, and they're not banks.
So Valerie, can you just send me some wording that would clear that up a little bit either more vague to cover
It's
us?
really
or-
close. Yeah. I mean, I wanted to say like brokerage accounts, but I don't want it to be open to any, like you said, Bitcoin or
Yeah.
Mhm.
Send me some wording so I can do it correctly in there. Okay.
Okay, I'll work on that one.
Okay. Okay. Home stretch. This is a nonprofit organization. ORRC board establishes annual operating budget, which we do. I don't think the members know what our operating budget is, which is I'm hoping to change at the annual membership meeting, which is why I want everybody to provide budgets so I can work with Valerie to prepare a proposed budget for next year. ORRC shall provide financial summary, annual report of club operations to the membership at least once a year, which we haven't been doing, but we're going to. No club funds may be deposited in the personal account of a member of the board. Treasurer reviews the status of the general funds at least quarterly and so on. So none of this has changed. We've kept that the same.
My only one was on 12.2. It says no loan should be made to by the club to members of the board or its employees. But what about members in general?
Yeah. No loan should be made by the club.
We shouldn't be making loans to
yeah.
anybody. Yeah.
Yep.
Agreed.
Yeah,
Agreed.
so change it. No loan shall be made by the club to members of ORRC. To members of ORRC.
Yeah.
Or its employees.
Or its employees should be listed there. Just
That's true, but the point here is that that if you serve on the board, you're serving as a volunteer. You don't have an expectation of
Yeah.
compensation.
Yeah. So go back to 12.1, the first sentence, third line, the word inure, I-N-U-R-E. That's the word I'm not familiar with. I looked it up, and as I looked up the definitions, I could see nothing that fits in here. So what are we trying to say? And I would like us to remove the word inure. And we've got it sometime later also again.
Sounds good to me.
So what do we mean?
It just shouldn't benefit the directors. Yeah.
Okay, so I would prefer to say that directly.
Okay, so
No
no
part of the net
part of the
income
net
of the club.
income shall
Shall not benefit, instead of inure to the, how about just shall not benefit its directors?
Actually, it says no part of the club shall
No.
benefit the directors.
Yeah. So basically, yeah, no part of the net income shall benefit its directors, officers, or other private persons.
Shall
provide-
not personally benefit the directors.
Okay.
No part shall benefit.
No more free t-shirts, everybody.
That's right. Well, we're volunteering. They're volunteer benefit.
Well, the free T-shirts serve a business purpose to the board.
Yeah, this is the net income. So
Yeah.
that's
Yeah.
Okay. I'm just taking to inure to that and then taking benefit its directors. That's how it's going to read.
And by the way, the word inure comes down in 14.1 below also.
1.
No part of the net earnings of all inures to the benefit of.
No part of the net earnings shall benefit or is distributable to its members, directors, trustees, officers, or the director. Okay, got it. Fix that one.
Okay.
Okay.
Good. Thank you.
Savings clause, failure or literal complete compliance with the provisions of the bylaws, respective dates, times, blah, blah, blah. We haven't changed that. Tax status and dissolution. Tax status and dissolution states that if we dissolve, the money has to go to a similar organization, a nonprofit organization.
yeah,
Right.
that's Oregon law.
Yeah.
Under 14.1, about 2/3 of the way down, it says no substantial part of ORRC's activities can be the carrying on of propaganda or otherwise attempting to influence legislation. We should be doing none of that as a 501c3.
And that's why we have that in there.
Well, I don't like that it says no substantial.
Substantial.
Oh,
Take out
It should be
substantial.
none of ORRC's
no part. So no part of
Good.
ORRC activities. Okay.
That's on that 990 and they'll.
Yeah. Okay.
Fine.
So no part of ORRC. We'll take out the word substantial. Okay.
Mhm.
Not carry activities not permitted by corporation. Dissolution. Okay. And amendments. These bylaws may be amended by a majority of those voting at an annual election as follows.
My question on that was why at least 120 days.
Yeah, that's a long time. Sounds like a university trying to change academics.
That's very bureaucratic. I mean,
Well,
it can't be 2 days. You need time for people to look at it, but that's
Consider it, sure.
I would think
that
30
30
days
days?
is fine.
30 days reasonable.
we can try to make it longer if we need more time, but definitely give them at least 30 days. Okay. Change that to
And
30.
grammatically here and in the 2 places below, there should be no hyphen between 30 and the word days.
Okay.
very good, Ellen.
You and me are kindred souls.
All right. Anything else? Anything else? As she smiles as she turns the page. Are we done?
Yeah. I just want to say, on 15.4, this is it. Mine's showing that proposed amendments in the language that, if adopted, there's extra space, but that's really picky. And I wanted to say this had to be in a ton of work, Carissa. This is amazing.
This is
Yes.
great, Carissa. Thank you.
Absolutely.
Okay, so I know Mark isn't here, but he said he supported anything
Uh,
you want.
One more thing in 15.6. The board may renumber, revise, codify, or correct any provision.
Okay, yeah.
Okay. So can we vote on accepting this? Now, we're still pending the wording from Valerie on that one little financial section,
Yeah.
but
And you're pending wording from me also.
and pending wording from you on that. Did we? I thought we got this. I thought we got yours.
No, you asked me to send it to you.
Okay, which section was that one?
I'm looking for it right
I
now.
don't remember it anymore. I thought we went through.
8-4,
6.2,
6-2.
6.2. Yeah, 6.2. So as I have it, an annual meeting of members must be held once per year at a time and place designated by the board. The annual meeting may be combined. Eliminates a sentence, yeah. Eliminates a sentence.
We're gonna send that wording. Valerie was gonna send her wording. And we've
Yep.
updated and revised everything else. So do we want to wait until next week to vote? Do we want to vote on this now, or do we want to wait until the meeting next week?
Well, with Mark's proxy, do we have a quorum?
Do I would like to vote on it now, if at all possible, so we can.
I
Could
think,
you- could you
didn't I
do
read
pending
somewhere
our
that we
changes
don't
in
have
the-
proxies?
What was that?
We don't have proxies. It's in
Yeah,
here.
we don't have proxies, so Mark is not
But you do
here.
have a quorum.
Oh, we have a quorum.
So
We
we're
have a
good.
quorum.
We have a quorum.
Yeah.
So could we say we approve them pending, and then you could just send out our 2 little changes?
As I will say, I will propose a motion here, put a motion on the floor to accept for nomination by the membership in general, the bylaws we discussed here, pending the corrections and language sent by Mr. Cabelli and Ms. Pratt, and to be presented for the 2024 year and going forward.
I second the motion.
Awesome. All in favor, say aye, raise your hand.
Aye.
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 Motion passes. So what we will do is we will get this to all updated. And then at the next meeting, we'll just say this is what we approved, and we're going to send forth to the members in the election. And Tracy wrote up I wrote a brief explanatory statement that I want to put on the website with the bylaws when we're going to create the election page on the website. So we have this explanatory statement, a link to the new bylaws. We'll have a link to the old bylaws as well, and then a list of all the candidates, so that everything will be there, and we'll include instructions on what's going to happen. What's going to happen with the election and this vote is I've scheduled an email. Well, there's going to be an email that goes out November 30th to all current members from Run Sign Up that will tell them, be sure to check your status. No, that's different. That's different. No, the email that's going out November 30th is to all current members and old members for the last, what did we say? 3 years? 2 years? At least 3 years, I think. Telling them to check their membership status. If they want to vote, they need to renew by December 4th. Otherwise, they will not get the invitation to vote in the election. We're
Tracy,
also,
will they know how to check their membership status?
that will be included in the email. Yeah, how to sign in and check
So
it.
is our official, I'm assuming the answer is yes. Maybe it's because I was out of the loop for a while, many years actually. Is our official ORRC membership database contained within Run Sign Up?
Yes.
And how do we as directors access it?
Just what you do is you actually access it by logging in with your personal login, and your personal login gives you access to certain things. So you would have access to dual through, you don't have to log in as Daniel Brewer board member, you log in as just your Daniel Brewer, however, and I'm commission as administrator.
Okay.
There's also going to be a newsletter going out as well that describes this, a special election newsletter that describes this. There's going to be multiple ways of contacting people in our database for what's going to be coming up. Okay. Thank you.
And we will be meeting next Tuesday night as normal.
Yes. Regular board meeting. Yes. Okay. Thank you so much for all of your wonderful input.
Carissa, very, very nicely done.
Thank you.
Awesome
Yes.
job.
You did a really good job.
Beautiful.
I know you didn't end up, I don't know if you got all the assistance that you were promised, but we ended up with a nice, clean bylaws and
hopefully we won't have to do this again for another 30 years of time.
Absolutely.
so I mean, the
Absolutely.
one thing I like about it is that it's durable, and we're not going to just have an amendment whenever somebody. I mean, if the club paradigm completely breaks down and changes, we got to wait till the end of the year to mess with these bylaws, and it makes us kind of have to live with what we have for a while instead of changing the rules in the middle of the stream so that it kind of suits our situation. I kind of think that was what created some of the, I hate to say this word, but laziness, because the last board was a lot of things, but the one thing they weren't was lazy. But administratively they were, and they just figured if we can't work through some of these things with the rules we have, we'll just change the rules. And because what we did today, I think, will allow us to bend our business to suit the current bylaws instead of the other way around. A little bit more traditional in the way it's supposed to work. So I appreciate all the efforts. I appreciate Carissa. I also appreciate your method, the project management end of it, the way you gathered that together. And I want to talk to you offline about that and see if there's some way we can get you some credit for it. So anyways, I appreciate that. I will, because I think what you've done is actually a Toastmasters project I can give you some credit for. And this particular year, I have actually been the place to do that. So
it's kind of amazing. This summer you were just questioning the bylaws, and now you've had to rewrite it all.
Yes. Oh my gosh.
well, isn't it ironic too that after we got to point 4, Mark had to leave, and he's the one probably that poured through them the most and the finest of anybody back in the summer. So, and then Mark, he said, "Hey, I'm good." I'm like, "You are?" All that hoo-ha.
Speaks to the quality of her work. So
By the
that
way,
was awesome.
we did this in 1995, and Alan Cavelli headed that committee for me. And this particular meeting took half the time tonight that one took. So
Okay, well, you guys, I'm in
You're
Tampa, Florida.
Wow.
I'm in Tampa, Florida, you guys, and it is 12:19
20
right now
after
for
12.
me.
Okay.
So
Bad.
I am signing off. Love y'all.
All right. We're
Good night.
Good night, all.
Thank you.
thanks, Margie.
Good night.
everybody.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks. Thank you, Chris.
Carissa.
Thank you, Carissa. It was really a job well done.
Awesome job. All right. Night, everybody.
Good night.
Night.